Listen, we are so happy that you are still with us here on the morning show on ETV. An interesting conversation that we're going to delve into involving equity, involvement, inclusion in the workplace. In fact, joining us live right now in studio is Dr. Ruwayne Kock, who is an industrial psychologist and executive committee member in charge of transformation at the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology of South Africa, also known as Siopsa. He joins us this morning to discuss one of the topics that will be unpacked at this year's Siopsa conference, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, and why so many companies are still, to this date, struggling to get things right. A very good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
I mean, right now, the conversation around diversity, I almost want to ask you, how far are we? Like, is there still much to be done? Has there been progress made, or is there still a long way to go still?
I think an important point to start is just the definition of, diversity within the context of equity and inclusion.
Right.
Because if you only look at diversity means having people of different kind of social categories, we also need to look at the equity, so the fairness thereof.
Yeah.
And also the sense of belonging that people have. So these three constructs work interchangeably, right? So it's about your sense of uniqueness, your sense of fairness, and your sense of belonging in the workplace. Now, to your question, how far have we come in South Africa to date? If one looks at just one source, which is the Employment Equity Report, which organizations on an annual basis report back to the equity on the employment equity. If one looks, for example, at top management, in terms of a report, 66% of top management positions in private sector organizations, NGOs, and educational institutions is still occupied by white people.
Okay.
75% is occupied by males. And so clearly, based on race and gender, although we've made some progress, we have a long way to go in South Africa.
Isn't it interesting, Ruwayne, because when you look at those stats, it's only 8% of white people within the workforce, am I right?
So if you look at what we call the EAP, so the number of people that are active population within, in terms of your different groups, white people only represent 8% of the EAP. And so relative to the number of people in employment, white people are overrepresented in terms of top management positions within, and we're only talking private sector organizations, NGOs, and educational institutions at this level, in terms of that stat that I referenced earlier.
Yeah. Why is it important, this whole DEI conversation within the workforce?
Look, I think from an organizational perspective, it's important that we leverage everyone in the organization, right? And so we know that research shows us that diversity, equity, inclusion is related to productivity, job satisfaction, employee engagement. And we know that those organizations that leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion outperforms those organizations that do not. We've seen recently within the US context where Black Lives Matter have brought this topic back into the fore and has given it attention again. And I think this is a moment for us to take up this conversation in South Africa as well and bring to the attention that most of these private sector organizations and NGOs and educational institutions are largely still untransformed. What you may see in some of these organizations on the top, you have some Black representation. And so when I talk about Black in this context, I talk about Black African ethnic groups, I talk about colored, and I talk about Indian ethnic groups. And so that's the reference when I talk about Black people.
And if we are to move things along, given how far we've come, who still needs to come to the party with the understanding of where it is we need to go when we're talking about DEI?
If I could answer it from a perspective of why does it fail, and then get back to your question, right?
Right.
So I think the reason why it fails is that we take a very programmatic approach to it. So it's a program that's part of the HR department somewhere that's run. And so for it to be effective, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it needs to be part of the organizational transformation, part of bringing about organizational change in terms of the culture of the organization. And culture, as we know, is the way we do things.
Okay.
And the way we do things should be around leveraging differences, creating fairness for those that are disadvantaged, and making sure that those that are marginalized, and marginalization in this context means that there's a stigma associated with your social group, whether it's your ethnic group or whether it's your gender, and that you're considered to be of a lower status.
And you're overlooked on those bases.
And you overlook, and how do you create a sense of belonging for those individuals in organizations? Now, to bring about that change, and we know from our work in organizational cultural change, is that you need buy-in from the top. And so I've cited some of the stats earlier in terms of that most of those positions are still occupied by white people, right? And so how do we get buy-in at that level to ensure that there's sponsorship around these initiatives? And how do we make sure that it's an integral part of our strategy of the organization so that it creates competitive advantage? So those that are, and in South Africa, the context is that we as Black people are the majority. And so we understand the customers that most of these organizations are targeting.
Right.
And so we are the ones that can provide that competitive advantage, and how, as an individual in an organization, a marketeer, an accountant, or whatever my profession may be, how are my differences leveraged in such a way that I create a competitive advantage for the organization?
I like that. I mean, that paints a clear picture of where we need to go next. And when we're talking about the initiatives, that need to take place, have the organizations said, okay, yes, we understand what the problem is. Now there's a solution in place that we can move things forward?
My sense is, and I don't have any data to back this up at this stage, but my sense is that most organizations sees this as a compliance. And so it's more of a compliance than an integral part of the organization.
Just to fill in the numbers.
So it's really around compliance, and that, of course, this is not all organizations, but I use my what we know in terms of the numbers at this stage, that we have not transformed South African organizations in the way that it's representative of the people of South Africa.
And when is the Siopsa conference happening this year?
So the Siopsa conference is on the 21st to the 23rd of July. And so there are a number of themes. And so the overarching theme is about rehumanizing work. And so what we mean by that is, with 4IR and with the pandemic, it's changed the way we work. And so one of the themes is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which we believe is the foundation to create more humane workplaces. With the new technology, ways of working that are changing, how do we ensure that we keep and maintain a humane place of work for people? And how do we ensure that those that feel marginalized are represented, feel that they belong, and are treated equally within the organization?
Thank you so much. That was Dr. Ruwayne Kock this morning on The Morning Show. Chalanat.